It started with a moment that nobody inside the Dodgers organization was fully prepared for, not because it involved a trade, not because it involved a game, but because it involved something far more personal, something that immediately shifted the emotional temperature of the entire franchise the second it became known that Shohei Ohtani had entered one of the most important chapters of his life. The arrival of his second child, a boy, a moment that quietly unfolded away from cameras but somehow managed to echo louder than anything happening on the field that week. At first, the information came in slowly, almost cautiously, as if even those inside the organization understood that this wasn't just another headline. It wasn't something to be rushed. It wasn't something to be turned into a discussion about baseball strategy. It was personal. And yet, the moment it became known, everything inside the Dodgers clubhouse changed instantly. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones were checked repeatedly. Players who were usually focused entirely on preparation suddenly found themselves speaking in softer tones, reacting not as athletes, but as people who genuinely understood the weight of the moment. Shohei Ohtani's wife, Mamiko, had given birth to their second child, a boy, and that single detail alone was enough to ripple through the entire organization in ways nobody expected. There was no official announcement ceremony inside the clubhouse, no press conference atmosphere at first, just quiet reaction spreading from one player to another until the entire room seemed to be connected by the same realization. And then something even more surprising happened. According to people inside the organization, Dave Roberts saw the baby shortly after the news circulated more privately within team circles, and his reaction wasn't what anyone expected from a manager who has seen everything baseball can offer. He paused for a long moment, studied the situation quietly, and then said something that immediately became the center of conversation among those who heard it. "He looks just like Shohei when he was little." That one sentence changed the tone of everything. Because it wasn't about baseball anymore. It wasn't about performance. It was about continuity. About legacy. About the strange, almost surreal feeling of watching a player who has already become larger than the sport itself now stepping into a role that makes him even more human than ever before. Inside the Dodgers clubhouse, that comment spread quickly, not because it was dramatic, but because it felt oddly emotional coming from someone like Roberts. A manager who normally speaks in careful, structured baseball language had just made a personal observation that made everyone stop for a second and think differently about Ohtani, not as a superstar, but as someone whose life story was continuing in a very visible way. And as that realization settled in, another layer of the story began unfolding inside the organization. Players started arriving at the hospital. Not as a media moment. Not as a publicity event. But as teammates who felt the need to be present. At first, it was just a few. Then more followed. And before long, a small group of Dodgers players had gathered quietly, creating an atmosphere that felt less like a professional sports environment and more like a family moment that extended beyond the field. They weren't there to interrupt anything. They weren't there to create attention. They were simply there because moments like this don't happen often in a career defined by competition and travel and pressure. Inside that hospital environment, the energy was noticeably different from anything associated with baseball. There were no discussions about lineups or pitching rotations. No debates about opponents. Instead, there were smiles, quiet conversations, and the kind of reactions that come naturally when people witness something meaningful happening to someone they respect deeply. At one point, according to team sources, the conversation inside the group shifted towards something unexpected. The name. Or more accurately, who would help decide it. What started as a light-hearted comment quickly turned into a playful but emotional moment when someone jokingly suggested that the teammates should have a say in the baby's name. At first, it was laughter. The kind of laughter that comes from relief and happiness and disbelief all mixing together at once. But then the idea lingered longer than expected. Because in a strange way, it reflected how close the team had become around Ohtani. He wasn't just a teammate. He was someone they felt connected to. Someone whose personal milestones felt shared, even if indirectly. And so the joke about leaving the name up to us became something everyone remembered, not because it was serious, but because it revealed the emotional closeness that had formed within the organization. But while the hospital moment continued quietly in the background, the reaction outside was becoming increasingly intense. Once the news began spreading more widely, fans immediately began reacting across social platforms, and the tone was overwhelmingly emotional rather than analytical. People weren't discussing statistics or baseball implications. They were reacting to the image of Ohtani stepping into fatherhood again, a moment that felt both monumental and deeply personal. And inside the Dodgers clubhouse, the reaction remained just as strong. Players kept returning to the same topic repeatedly throughout the day. Some would see the news again and smile as if seeing it for the first time. Others would share small personal reflections about family, children, and what it means to balance life with a demanding professional career. Even veterans who had experienced similar milestones themselves admitted that seeing Ohtani in this moment felt different, because of how globally recognized he is and how private he normally remains. There was a sense that something had changed, not in his baseball identity, but in the way people around him perceived him as a person. A quiet shift. Not loud. Not dramatic. But meaningful. And then, as if the story needed one more layer, Dave Roberts spoke again, this time elaborating slightly on his earlier comment about Ohtani's childhood resemblance. He didn't go into unnecessary detail, but he reinforced what he had said before, almost as if confirming that the feeling wasn't just a passing impression. It was something that struck him immediately the moment he saw the baby. That connection between past and present added another dimension to the story, because it made people think about how athletes are often seen as static figures, frozen in highlight reels, when in reality their lives are constantly evolving in ways the public rarely gets to witness. And as the day continued, one thing became increasingly clear inside the Dodgers organization. This wasn't just a news moment. It wasn't just a clubhouse reaction. It wasn't just another update involving a superstar player. It was a transition. A reminder that even the most extraordinary careers are built alongside deeply personal human experiences that rarely make headlines in the same way performance does. But just as things seemed to settle, one final detail began circulating quietly among those closest to the situation, something about the timing of the hospital gathering, something about the way players were informed, and something about what Ohtani himself may have said during those early private moments that had not yet been fully revealed to the public. When that final detail began circulating quietly inside the Dodgers circle, the atmosphere around the organization shifted again, not loudly, not suddenly, but in that slow, almost invisible way that happens when a story starts gaining depth beyond what the public initially sees. Players who had already reacted emotionally to the birth news and the hospital gathering now found themselves revisiting everything with a slightly different mindset, as if there was another layer they had missed the first time. Because what was now being discussed wasn't just the arrival of Ohtani's second child anymore. It was the timing. The coordination. The way information moved through the team. And most importantly, the way Ohtani himself handled it internally before anything reached the outside world. Inside the clubhouse, one detail stood out more than anything else. According to multiple quiet conversations among team members, Ohtani didn't treat the moment like a public announcement at all. There was no sense of urgency, no attempt to draw attention, no visible shift in his usual calm structure. Instead, what teammates noticed was something far more consistent with everything they already knew about him. Control. Precision. And a quiet desire to keep personal life separated from noise, even when that personal life involved something as meaningful as becoming a father again. And that contrast made the situation even more powerful. Because while the world reacted instantly, inside the organization the feeling was more grounded, more respectful, almost like everyone understood without being told that this wasn't a moment for spectacle. It was a moment for presence. That understanding became even clearer when players began reflecting on what had happened at the hospital. The group that had gathered there didn't describe it as chaotic or emotional in a loud way. Instead, they described it as calm. almost unusually calm for a moment of such significance. There were smiles, yes. There was laughter at certain points. But there was also a strange sense of order to everything, as if the environment itself reflected the personality of the person at the center of it all. Shohei Ohtani has always been described by teammates as structured, almost methodical in how he moves through both baseball and life. And now, even this deeply personal milestone seemed to carry that same tone. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt uncontrolled. Even the reactions around him seemed to settle into a rhythm rather than a burst. But then came Dave Roberts again, and this time his comment about the baby looking like Ohtani when he was little began to take on a different meaning inside the clubhouse conversations. It wasn't just a casual observation anymore. Players started repeating it, not as a joke, but as a point of reflection. Because if that resemblance was real, or even symbolic, then it created something almost narrative-like about Ohtani's journey, as if the story was looping back on itself in a way that felt strangely poetic. One player reportedly said it felt like watching a legacy continue in real time, not in a dramatic sports sense, but in a human sense. Another joked that Ohtani didn't need scouting reports anymore because apparently life itself was producing his next generation. The humor returned briefly, but it was softer now, less about laughter and more about processing something meaningful. And somewhere in that mix of reactions, the conversation about the baby's name resurfaced again, but this time it wasn't playful. It was curious in a more thoughtful way. Players weren't joking about deciding it anymore. Instead, they were trying to understand it, trying to interpret whether the name carried significance tied to family history, cultural meaning, or personal philosophy. Because with Ohtani, nothing ever feels random. Every routine has structure. Every decision has intent. Every pattern has purpose. That is how teammates describe him, and that is why even something as simple as a name becomes a topic of deep discussion inside the clubhouse. And while all of this was unfolding internally, the public reaction continued to grow in intensity, but still with a very different tone than typical sports headlines. This wasn't about controversy. It wasn't about competition. It was about admiration. People weren't debating his performance. They were reacting to his life. That distinction mattered more than it seemed. Because it meant the story had stepped outside of baseball's usual narrative structure and entered something broader, something more emotional, something more universal. Back inside the Dodgers organization, Dave Roberts was once again asked to expand on his earlier comments, particularly the idea that the baby resembled Ohtani in his younger years. And this time, his response carried a slightly different weight. He explained that what struck him wasn't just physical resemblance, but something harder to define. The sense of familiarity. The feeling that he was looking at the continuation of a story he had already been watching unfold for years. He paused before adding that moments like this remind you that athletes, no matter how extraordinary, are still people living full lives outside the game. Lives that grow, change, and evolve in ways that statistics can never capture. That comment lingered in the room longer than expected. Because it reframed everything again. Not as a sports update. Not as a headline. But as a reminder of time moving forward. And as that idea settled in, another quiet development began within the clubhouse. The earlier discussions about gifts, which had temporarily faded into the background after the hospital news, began resurfacing in a more structured form. Players were no longer just suggesting ideas casually. They were organizing them. Assigning responsibility. Thinking about how to create something meaningful that would properly reflect the moment without turning it into something performative. The shift was subtle, but important. Because it showed that the reaction was no longer just emotional. It was becoming intentional. Meanwhile, one final layer of curiosity began spreading through the organization, tied again to that earlier mention of unexpected circumstances surrounding Ohtani's hospital departure. While no official clarification changed the core understanding of the situation, the ambiguity itself kept the story alive. And in professional sports media, ambiguity often becomes the fuel for narrative expansion. But inside the clubhouse, that ambiguity didn't create tension. It created patience. Players who knew Ohtani well enough understood that not every detail needs to be public, and not every moment needs explanation. Some things exist quietly, and that quietness is part of what makes them meaningful. As the day slowly moved forward, the energy inside the Dodgers organization began to stabilize again, but the impact of the moment remained. Conversations returned to baseball eventually, but not fully. The memory of the photos, the presence of the hospital gathering, the manager's reflections, and the subtle mystery surrounding the timing all lingered in the background like a second storyline running parallel to the season itself. And even as players returned to routines, there was a shared understanding that something had shifted, not in standings, not in performance metrics, but in perspective. Because moments like this don't just become stories. They become reference points. The kind of moment people look back on later and remember not because of what was said publicly, but because of how it felt inside the room. And in that sense, the story of Shohei Ohtani's second child, the reactions from teammates, the manager's reflections, and the quiet uncertainty around the hospital timeline all began forming something larger than a single event. It became a chapter. One that still didn't feel fully written. And somewhere within that unfinished chapter, one final question remained unanswered inside the Dodgers organization, quietly lingering beneath all the celebration and reflection.